I am James Bradley, and this is Untold Pacific, a podcast series which mines 40 years of my life in Asia and my 4 best-selling books to create historical travelogues about the American experience on the other side of the Pacific. I visited Vietnam for the first time in 2007 because my daughter was working in Ho Chi Minh City, which she and most residents refer to as Saigon. I had no intention of writing a book about Vietnam War. Actually, I had an active aversion to the idea. To me, that period was just too negative. But Saigon's bright sunshine seemed to wash away my dark foreboding, and I was surprised at the people's acceptance of me, an American. I noticed a cheerfulness about the Vietnamese I had not imagined. Now, after years of interviewing Vietnamese war veterans, something has dawned on me. While the war had been a tragedy for Americans, it was a tragedy and a victory for the Vietnamese. And while the war was an anomaly for America, its first military defeat, it was a recurring event for the Vietnamese, for whom invasions are like regular typhoons. The Vietnamese had suffered grievously to expel the Americans, but they had accomplished their mission. The Vietnamese possessed an inner confidence of winners. I learned that pushing invaders out of Vietnam is the central story of Vietnamese history. Vietnam is a richly endowed country located in a strategic position. Various empires throughout the ages have tried to control Vietnam. Centuries of resistance to invaders. That's Vietnam's history in a nutshell. Vietnam's historical motto should be, always invaded, never conquered. It's resistance to invaders that forms the basis for Vietnam's glory days. The Mongolian invaders were tough, but the wily Vietnamese sent them back to Mongolia, retreating with their tails between their legs. The Vietnamese fought the Chinese invaders for over 2,000 years. The Grand French Empire. Where did Michelin rubber come from? From the rubber plantations of Vietnam. France thought that they could control it forever. And then the Japanese came and they were repulsed also. I was in my early teens in the 1960s when all-powerful America invaded Vietnam. Years later, I asked myself, how did these peasant farmers in a third-world agricultural country defeat the world's most powerful nation? After all, America had 5 times the population of Vietnam. The U.S. threw 500,000 of its soldiers into the fight. The U.S. dominated the air and the sea and dropped 7.5 million tons of explosive bombs. We threw 400,000 tons of burning napalm. We poured illegal chemicals all over Vietnam. In contrast, the Vietnamese had no secure bases. They operated from primitive jungles and dark underground tunnels. Their main supply network, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was attacked by the United States continuously, making it the most bombed spot in history. On paper, the U.S. looked invincible, while the Vietnamese fought with one hand tied behind their backs. How did tiny Vietnam beat America? I began to ask many Vietnamese a simple question. How did you win? My questioning began in a Saigon coffee shop, and for the last 10 years has had me travel the breadth and length of Vietnam. I asked former government officials, including aides to Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnamese generals and soldiers, scholars, Vietnam fighters, prisoners, current-day artists, authors, filmmakers, and many ordinary Vietnamese the question, how did you win? Over centuries, the Vietnamese have developed highly successful strategies and tactics against invaders. One idea that surprised me is the participation of females in Vietnamese wars. It's not in the American historical narrative that the women stand up and fight along with their men, but in Vietnam there's a long history of this. You see, the early assaults against tiny Vietnam by the Chinese were so powerful that every Vietnamese person, grandma and grandpa, husband and wife, brother and sister, had to learn how to resist. Soon all could recite the famous saying, "If the invader sets one foot in Vietnam, everyone stands up, even the women." There's the famous story of the Trung sisters. When China first invaded Vietnam with an all-male army, Vietnamese women led the successful defense. China was a patriarchal country, while Vietnam had long practiced sexual equality. Vietnamese women could become scholars, judges, soldiers, and even rulers. After the Chinese executed her husband, the elder Trung sister, she was in her 30s, teamed up with her sister to raise an army of 80,000, many of them women. When the Trung sisters defeated the Chinese and Vietnam regained its independence, the Trung sisters ruled as victorious queens. Within a few years, the Chinese army regrouped and invaded Vietnam again in 43 AD, and this time crushed Vietnamese defenses. The Trung sisters, the ruling queens, killed themselves by leaping into a river. In the 1950s and the 1960s, French and American leaders like Henry Kissinger came to Vietnam, and they would see one day that the Vietnamese would take off to honor the Trung sisters. They would see women portraying the Trung sisters up on elephants. They must have thought this was very cute. They didn't realize they were witnessing a long history of Vietnamese women helping to push out the invaders. At least 4 of the Americans whose names are inscribed on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington were killed by a Vietnamese woman. Mrs. Mai is renowned for her sniper skills during the 1960s and the 1970s. One sunny afternoon, I entered Mrs. Mai's stately home. Mrs. Mai was 64 years old, a handsome, straight-backed woman with chiseled features. She reminded me of a retired high school principal, comfortable with authority. She welcomed me into her living room. She bade me to sit on her teak couch. I sat down. She left the room. She came back with a tray bearing a teapot and teacups. She poured me some tea and offered to me politely. I was getting ready to interview her. I always start the interviews because I'm the one who had initiated the request. I got my pens and paper ready, but when I looked up, I saw in her eyes that she wanted to say something to me before I began. She spoke evenly, but her watering eyes betrayed deep emotion. She said, "It was 50 years ago. I was 15 years old. My father was 49. The U.S. was building an airstrip near our home. One day American Marines approached. Some guerrillas were meeting inside. My father was the lookout. The Marines came into our property and shot my father in the head, killing him. I was just a young girl, but I immediately vowed that I would kill every American I ever saw." After a moment of silence, I asked her, "How did you do?" Her back stiffened and she answered, "I did very well. You Americans were big targets, very noisy, easy to kill. I was a sniper. If you're very quiet and have a lot of patience, you can be very effective. I would be hidden and wait until the Americans got near me. The Americans were big and noisy, easy to spot in their uniforms. They moved in bunches, so you always knew where they were. I would be across a river with all the time in the world to wait for the perfect shot. I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I'd aim for their head. I'd shoot, kill one, and then run away without being seen. I killed 4 Americans that way and got 2 medals. Am I proud and happy about that? The Americans killed my father, my brother, and my brother-in-law, and many of my neighbors. I didn't choose to be put in the position of having to kill people. I was determined. The U.S. had more powerful weapons, and I was young but had a strong belief in our righteous cause. We were determined to fight against the U.S. despite any and all hardships. Ho Chi Minh said it the best. Nothing is more precious than our freedom. American soldiers invaded Vietnam. We are peace lovers, so we had to fight to drive the Americans out. On March 3, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the U.S. air campaign against North Vietnam, got off to a start as 100 U.S. Air Force jets bombed an ammunition dump 10 miles into North Vietnamese territory. The next day, March 6, 1965, an 18-year-old Hanoi schoolgirl named Win Un Thi sat upright at her desk listening to Ho Chi Minh over the radio. Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho to girls like Little Miss T, was Vietnam's George Washington-like national hero who just 10 years earlier had freed Vietnam from the French. Ho skillfully utilized words and images from Vietnam's history of resistance. As the 68-year-old Mrs. T told me many years later, Uncle Ho said that the American invader had set foot on Vietnam. He asked all Vietnamese to stand up, men and women. This is our history. I imagine that I had died at that moment. My life went to my country. It was not my life anymore. As Uncle Ho said, nothing is more precious than freedom. Over the radio, Uncle Ho instructed different segments of the population to do different things. Young women like me were to report for duty on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. One day I was a schoolgirl. The next day I reported for duty not knowing or caring how long I would fight. Miss T served on the Ho Chi Minh Trail for 8 years, until a U.S. bomb collapsed the tunnel in which she was hiding. She told me many years later. Uncle Ho warned us that conditions would be hard. Our job was to build and repair roads on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to open new roads and to repair roads bombed by the U.S. We had few clothes. Water came from a stream. We were all under 20 years old. We had no machines, sometimes no shovel, hammer, or even a spoon. But we did not doubt our success. We followed Uncle Ho's ideas, how to do our best. At the end of our interview, 68-year-old Miss T told me, I am old now, but if Vietnam is invaded, I will return to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. One sunny winter day, I took a taxi to interview Miss Nguyen Thi Tuan outside of Dong Ha, Vietnam. She lives alone in a modest 4-room home. She opened her front door as I approached, and she welcomed me. She's a handsome-looking 62-year-old lady, her back unbent by age. She was dressed attractively in a matching pants and jacket outfit. 2 things about her stood out. Her right sleeve hung loosely. She was missing her right arm. And she was obviously tense. No smile creased her face. I would soon learn why. Miss Tuan told me, it was in 1965 when I was 13 years old that I first became involved in the war. I led soldiers to the battle and gave them fruit and rice. Soldiers would come from the north and they didn't know the way. They marched at night so they couldn't be seen. There were many twists and turns, and as a young child, I knew the area. I carried a bag of rice for them to eat later. When I was 16, helicopters came and dropped U.S. soldiers to sweep our village. They were looking for our leaders in secret tunnels. I hid in a tunnel. They used metal sticks to probe. They opened the top of my tunnel and threw a grenade in. I was injured. I had pieces of shrapnel in me from head to toe. They pulled me out and cleaned me up. They tied my hands behind my back and started questioning me. Our leader had taught us how to answer. We are teachers. We are nurses. So that's all I said. They brought me into a building with its walls blown out. In the corner, they tied me down to a wooden bed. They put a towel over my face and poured on water and soap. Soapy water into my nose and my mouth. Sometimes I couldn't breathe. Then they stood me up and screamed at me, "Are you afraid now? Well, then tell us about the secret tunnels." I wouldn't talk. They kept putting soap on my face. Then they poured a pepper powder on my face, and that hurt quite a lot. For 2 days I was tortured like this, but I wouldn't tell them anything. South Vietnamese army guys were torturing me, but a U.S. advisor was watching. They spread my legs and pulled my pants down. They put a beer bottle in me, and they broke it with a brick while I was inside of me. I'm crying now as I tell you this, Mr. Bradley, but I didn't cry then. The U.S. advisor leaned over next to my face, pinched my face, and said, "You're so pig-headed." Then they used a rifle and stuck it up into me. The U.S. advisor watched the South Vietnamese torture me. I was not afraid. I didn't cry. Oh my God, it hurt so much. There was a lot of blood, but I didn't scream or cry. I didn't say one word. Miss Tuan continued to tell her story that a grenade went off in the building. Many people were injured. Her arm was badly mangled, and a U.S. advisor came to her and said, "If you sign this confession, we will try to save your arm. If not, we'll cut it off with no anesthetic." Miss Tuan continues, "I had 1 day to think. I decided not to sign. They cut off my arm. I had no anesthetic, no pills, no medicine. They cut my arm and stitched it up. I thought I was going to die, but I didn't cry, not a word." Uncle Ho said that no matter what, if we are still alive, we have to fight for our freedom. We believed 100% in our revolution. We stayed 100% positive. We were ready to die for our country. When I was in prison, all I wanted was for the country to win the war. The torture, hunger, beatings, those were all secondary. We hugged each other and got hit together. After the beatings, we would sing revolutionary songs. It's true, Mr. Bradley, that I've had health problems through the years as a result of my torture, and it's hard to go through life with only one hand. But while my health has decreased, my spirit has stayed the same. I never cried under torture. I never gave in, not one word. I am proud of that. I was a volunteer for the revolution. My country is now free. Looking at my awards on my wall makes me happy now. As we said goodbye, Miss Tuan was full of smiles, and I realized that she just had to get it off her chest, this horrible story, telling me, an American, about how she lost her arm, how she was tortured. But as she waved goodbye, I saw that smile of a brave woman who did not give up. Today, many Americans still argue that we could have won the Vietnam War if only we had bombed Vietnam into the Stone Age. To check out this "we could have bombed them more" argument, I traveled to the village of Vinh Linh, which was just on the northern side of the demilitarized zone. It's a place that the United States did turn into a parking lot. U.S. Marine artillery, U.S. Navy bombardment, and U.S. Air Force airstrikes pounded this district mercilessly, forcing the residents underground. I interviewed Miss Thai Nguai, who never smiled during our time together, in which she told me, "Mr. Bradley, I admit it's a little difficult to speak with you. American bombing forced me to live underground for months. Do you know what being in water up to your chest for a long time can do to a woman's health? I was angry that I had to live, eat, and sleep underground with bombs exploding over my head. It was dark with rats, insects, and snakes. U.S. airplanes destroyed all our bowls, not one bowl to eat from. We put porridge in a jar and then passed it around. From the beginning of the war, we felt Vietnam would win. We were ready to sacrifice our lives. We came out at night. I was just a young girl, but I was trained to operate anti-aircraft guns and shoot missiles. Once I had a direct hit on a U.S. Navy ship, and I watched it burn on the dark water." Have you ever seen the movie Papillon? It stars Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. It was shot in the 1970s. It's about two prisoners jailed on the French prison island, which was called Devil's Island, off the coast of South America. France also had a Devil's Island prison complex in Vietnam. It was on a Vietnamese island called Con Dao, which is about 200 miles south of Ho Chi Minh City, out into the ocean. I lived on this former prison island of Con Dao for almost 2 years. Visitors today to Con Dao arrive from Saigon on one of 6 daily propeller aircraft flights. The 20-minute drive from the airport to town is along a beautiful cliff-hugging road. Taxi passengers ooh and ah the breathtaking ocean views as the driver is alert for grazing cows around the next hairpin turn. For foreigners, Con Dao is an island playground with excellent scuba diving, crystal clear waters, and pristine beaches. The hotels are clean, the prices are reasonable, and the seafood is delicious. On the other hand, most of the Vietnamese who come to Con Dao are pilgrims honoring their ancestors' sacrifices. They arrive with flower bouquets and special incense. Government brochures refer to Con Dao as a holy land. In the West, we consider battlefields like Gettysburg and Iwo Jima holy lands, site of military valor and victory. But Con Dao is a holy land because it represents a Vietnamese attribute held higher than battlefield bravery, and that is resistance to the invader. Defenseless prisoners endured confinement, malnutrition, beatings, humiliation, and torture from the French and Americans who operated Con Dao. Yet the Vietnamese resisted and they persisted. The heroine of the island, and a national hero all over Vietnam, is a beautiful and brave young woman named Vo Thi Sao. The spelling is V-O, separate word T-H-I, last name Sao, S-A-U, Vo Thi Sao. You can see Vo Thi Sao schools and memorials all across Vietnam. 14-year-old Miss Sao had seen French soldiers abuse her neighbors. At 17, the French arrested her for her attempted hand grenade killing of a French officer. A French court sentenced Miss Sao to death, but cowardly officials were afraid to execute her on the mainland and risk protests, so they shipped her to Con Dao to execute her. They thought they could get away with this silently. Miss Sao spent one night on Con Dao in the French police station, which is now the Vo Thi Sao Museum. The French police chief and his French wife lived within the station, with offices, the jail, and the living quarters wrapped around a beautiful interior garden. The French lady later wrote about Miss Sao and described her as young, beautiful, dressed simply, with a confident bearing and piercing, intelligent eyes. The French lady made Miss Sao a bed in the family quarters, but awakened in the middle of the night to see Miss Sao in the garden, singing a resistance song to the flowers, just hours before she was to be killed. In the morning, French officials tied Miss Sao's hands behind her back as she quietly sang resistance songs. Before marching Miss Sao off to her death, the French officials encouraged her to save her soul and introduced her to a French priest. Miss Sao looked at the priest and said it was him who was going to go to hell. They walked Miss Sao past the French doctor's villa, in which I later lived for almost 2 years. They took her to an empty walled courtyard inside one of the prisons. They took her to the far wall and put her up against it. They tried to blindfold her, but she protested. She wanted to see her executioners look them in the eye. The riflemen lined up for their officer's order. Ready, aim, fire. They all fired, but Miss Sao stood untouched. Each of the riflemen was embarrassed, and he shot over her head, thinking that the other guy would kill her. The officer looked at Miss Sao, She was standing upright, still singing, looking everybody in the eye. The infuriated officer then shot her. For the first time in her long ordeal, Miss Sao hung her head. The French hoped that they could prevent the first female executed on Condau from becoming a martyr by hiding her body in an unmarked spot. But she had already entered the hearts of thousands of prisoners who had heard that she was on the island. By the evening of her execution, the prison grapevine had revealed the location of her burial plot, and prisoners who worked as stonemasons built a headstone over her grave. The next day, outraged French officials discovered this, destroyed it, and dragged the guilty stonemasons out of their cells and beat them publicly. But that evening, another headstone appeared, followed by French destruction and more beatings. On and on this went until the French had created a national hero. America has Betsy Ross, France has Joan of Arc, and Vietnam has Vo Thi Sao. The villa I lived in was only a short 10-minute motorbike ride to Miss Sao's grave, which is by far the most visited spot on the island of Condau. Pilgrims place on Miss Sao's black marble sarcophagus many multicolored sprays of flowers, baskets of fruit, whole roasted pigs, and hundreds of incense sticks. Cemetery guards have to constantly remove the last hour's offerings to make room for the next wave. I wanted to see if there was ever a time that there wasn't someone at her tomb. I went there in the early morning, at dusk, and in the middle of the day, and I always found hushed mourners there honoring her. There are thousands of prisoners buried in Condau Cemetery, but it's easy to find Miss Sao's stone coffin, even in the darkness. You just walk towards the bonfire created by the burning candles and incense sticks surrounding her grave. I stood alone looking at Miss Sao's likeness, carved in relief in white stone. A glance at the incense sticks burning told me that someone had just left. And sure enough, in less than 10 minutes, I heard a group approaching, 4 of them laden with memorial gifts, and 2 pushing a metal shopping cart heaped with flowers in the middle of the night. It turns out I had witnessed one of the few moments when a Vietnamese pilgrim was not at Miss Sao's side. I watched as the group cleaned her vault, brushing the few specks of dust off it, lighting incense, unpacking and placing offerings in Miss Sao's honor. In the darkness, I could see people's eyes glistening as they honored this hero of the nation, the subject of postage stamps and high school plays. A few days later, I was writing at my villa when I noticed an old but sprightly woman seated on the seawall directly across the street from me. I put down my pen, crossed the street, sat next to her, and said hello. She asked me if I was an American. When I answered yes, she raised her blouse to show me an entrance wound in her stomach and a larger exit wound in her back, the result of being shot by an American Marine in 1969. You know, I've lost count of the number of Vietnamese who have shown me their war gashes when they learn that I'm an American. Then she repeated the words that so many of the Vietnamese scarred by my countrymen have said to me. Well, Uncle Holt told us not to hate, so I accept you as a friend. I learned that this older lady was from Hue in central Vietnam, and a trip to Con Dao, far out in the South China Sea, involved 2 airplane flights. It took a lot of time. I asked her why she was visiting Con Dao. To see Miss Sao, she answered. Why? I pressed. She answered, because I am Vietnamese. I've lived off and on in Saigon, and I became friendly with some kindly Vietnamese grandmothers. We would get together, and these older ladies would show me photos of their grandkids. They'd complain about their arthritis, and then they'd tell me stories about how they had killed the French and American soldiers who had made the mistake of coming to Vietnam. Grandma Bibi, a little tiny lady about 4.5 feet tall, very quiet, told me about her special mission. This is her story. It was 1948 when the French army came to our village. They beat us up, tortured some of my neighbors, and shot anyone they wanted to. I was only 13 years old, but I swore I had to fight. I am ready to fight the French, I told her. The night I left home, my mother cried, worried that I, as a young girl, might not be good on the battlefield and that I would ruin the family reputation. I kissed her and I snuck out the window. I learned how to throw grenades, shoot and clean rifles, how to disassemble them, transport the parts in separate pouches, and then reassemble them. I worked as a courier. I put on black pajamas and pretended to be a market woman with a basket of fruit on my head. Underneath were grenades, rifle parts, and secret messages. One day my leader chose me for a special project, the Majestic Hotel Cinema mission. We learned that French Navy troops were going to have dinner in the Majestic Hotel's restaurant and then go directly to the hotel cinema. My leader sent people to do the reconnaissance. We learned there were always French Navy sentries at the door. They searched people's bags before entering the cinema. Our strategy was to send young, pretty girls. The French sailors wanted us in there, but the challenge was the inspection at the door. 4 of us girls, I was the youngest at 15, the oldest was 28, put on our traditional dresses and paid attention to our makeup. We had 3 grenades among us. They were made in France. Our people had harvested them from a battlefield. I had one of the grenades. I put it in my clutch. On the way to the Hotel Majestic on June 10, 1948, we stopped at a street vendor and bought expensive candy and perfume. Our leader had warned us that the French sentries sometimes smelled hands. We used a lot of perfume and wiped our hands and our hair to mask any smell of the grenades. The candy had a strong, sweet smell, and we placed the candy in our clutches atop the grenades. Inside the Majestic Hotel, we 4 beautiful young girls smiled as we approached the French sentries at the cinema entrance. The first girl spoke French, and she gave the sentries some candy. They smiled. Underneath that candy in her clutch was a grenade. I opened my clutch, took out the ticket, and handed it to the sentry. He looked at my open clutch. On the top was some paper money, makeup, and candy. I got in with my grenade. The French Navy guys sat up front. We sat behind them. We had been instructed to sit through the advertisements and wait until the lights went out. The loud click of the movie projector was our signal. I was so nervous. I felt like it was forever. Then the lights went out. Click! 3 grenades went sailing silently through the air. I aimed at the French captain, the VIP. Then it was all screams and a mass of people running around, people crawling on the floor bleeding. One of us girls got out of the cinema right away. Then the French closed the doors. One of us was injured, bleeding, so the soldiers let her out. Now I and the other girl were trapped. She found a ticket on the floor from the VIP section. She spoke French and told the soldiers that since we were seated with the French sailors, we couldn't have thrown the grenades. All 4 of us made it back to our base. Over the years of my course of conversations with these Viet Cong ladies, I learned that they had all been captured, they had been imprisoned on the Con Dao prison island, they were tortured by French or U.S. forces. These ladies would break down periodically as they described to me, a younger American male, about how they felt when belts slapped their breasts, shampoo was pumped into their mouths, and beer bottles broken in their vaginas. Mrs. Nut, the 83-year-old leader of the group, was doused with Agent Orange in her home village, and then she became what they called a long-haired warrior. She was captured and tortured by Vietnamese jailers with American advisors holding clipboards, observing from the shadows. At the end of one of our interview sessions, Mrs. Nut stood in front of all the other Viet Cong ladies, who straightened their backs, and she summarized a message they wanted me to remember for the rest of my life. Mr. Bradley, Miss Nutt said. The Mongols came and we beat them. The Chinese came, we beat them. The French and the Japanese came, we beat them too. Then you Americans came and we beat you. You invaders all made the same mistake. You only send 50% of your power, your men. In Vietnam, the women fight. We use all our power. Many countries like the United States don't have this long tradition of female resistance to invaders like the Vietnamese do for obvious reasons. If you go to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, you'll see that there's 58,260 names chiseled into its black marble. Only 8 names belong to women. Females make up 0.01% of the total. But in Vietnam, so many women fought, and that spirit still lives on with the younger Vietnamese women. One of my many Vietnamese interpreters was a young lady named Trang. She was 24 years old. She still lived at home with her parents, blushed when she talked about her boyfriend. One day we were bent over our computers translating and editing interviews, and I posed a question to her. I said, Trang, we've been interviewing veterans, trying to find out why Vietnam beat France and America. What's your explanation? I was startled by her physical transformation. She went from being a young girl to a straight-backed woman warrior before my eyes. Trang straightened her back, held her head high, and said to me, "It is because of our courage. We are not afraid of death. We love our country. We can't lose even a meter of our land just because others want to take it."